When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez brought a multi-trillion-dollar binder to a budget hearing, she expected a debate on morality, not a strict dismantling of her arithmetic by a single cheap pocket notebook. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked into the Senate carrying a $4.7 trillion proposal and the confidence of someone who expected the room to debate her priorities, not dissect her arithmetic. The Senate Budget Committee hearing was supposed to be another dry exercise in federal spending priorities, the kind of proceeding that usually drains the gallery long before the second round of coffee. But this time, the room was packed because Ocasio-Cortez was there to defend her climate and community resilience plan. She took her seat at the witness table with the binder centered in front of her, staffers positioned behind her, microphone adjusted with deliberate precision. Every movement was controlled, every detail signaling that she had come prepared to command the room. At the opposite end of the dais sat Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, jacket open, water untouched, a cheap, spiral-bound pocket notepad resting beside his hand like an object that had accidentally wandered into a hearing, surrounded by expensive briefing books and Senate folders. The contrast looked almost ridiculous, except that Kennedy had not brought the little notebook for decoration, and before the hearing was over, that cheap piece of paper would matter more than every polished binder in the room. Ocasio-Cortez began exactly where she was strongest, not with cost tables, administrative structures, or distribution formulas, but with morality. She told the committee that what she was presenting was not a fantasy, not a progressive wish list, but a moral obligation, carefully placing the argument on terrain where disagreement could immediately be treated as something colder than fiscal skepticism. Then came the story of her grandmother in Puerto Rico, a 4-year-old woman who endured months without reliable electricity after Hurricane Maria, heating water on a camping stove, and organizing daily life around the setting sun because the power system had failed her. The story was real, the suffering was real, and the emotional weight was obvious. But attaching that suffering to a $4.7 trillion federal spending proposal was doing political work far beyond simple remembrance. Ocasio-Cortez was not merely describing hardship, she was constructing a frame in which questioning the bill could be made to look like questioning whether people deserve functioning communities at all. That distinction mattered because this was a budget hearing, not a rally, and budgets eventually have to survive questions that applause cannot answer. Ocasio-Cortez pushed forward anyway, insisting that the discussion was bigger than line items and suggesting that anyone who rejected the spending should be willing to say so publicly in front of the cameras. It was a familiar political tactic, move the argument from whether a particular spending mechanism works to whether the person questioning it cares enough about suffering. The room understood the maneuver even if nobody interrupted it, and Kennedy simply wrote a short line in his pocket notebook while she continued. He did not compete with the grandmother story, did not challenge her emotional framing, did not try to deliver a counter speech about his own values, because he was waiting for the hearing to return to the one place where passion eventually has to meet arithmetic. When Kennedy was finally recognized, he began with respect for the story rather than contempt for it, acknowledging that he understood what hardship looked like from his own upbringing in Zachary, Louisiana. Then he stripped away the emotional insulation with one question: what does $4.7 trillion amount to per American household? The question was almost offensively simple compared with the scale of the proposal, which was exactly why it worked, because Washington can hide almost anything inside trillions until someone drags the number back to a kitchen table. Ocasio-Cortez immediately resisted the framing, arguing that per-household calculations were reductive and depended on implementation offsets and projected returns. Kennedy did not chase her explanation because the question was not whether sophisticated modeling existed somewhere in a binder. The question was what ordinary families were being asked to finance. He supplied the number himself, more than $36,000 per American household. Suddenly, the $4.7 trillion figure stopped floating above the room as an abstract federal number and landed where people actually live, beside mortgages, tuition payments, vehicles, medical bills, groceries, and retirement savings. Kennedy described it as real money earned by real people, and that phrasing cut directly against the habit of discussing trillions as though federal dollars arrived from some separate universe where nobody had to work to produce them. Ocasio-Cortez reacted quickly, pointing to the enormous cost of illness treatment and critiquing Republican efforts on health care, a pivot designed to make Kennedy defend his party instead of continuing to examine her proposal. It was sharp, politically effective, and almost completely beside the point Kennedy had placed on the table. Kennedy refused to follow her into that argument. He made the obvious distinction that her bill was not a health care bill and that most of its spending had nothing to do with hospitals, treatment, or insurance, then returned to what he called the receipt. That was the first real fracture in Ocasio-Cortez's strategy because she was trying to widen the argument every time Kennedy narrowed it. She wanted to discuss suffering, health care, inequality, climate risk, and what working Americans deserved. Kennedy wanted to know what the government was purchasing and what the transaction would cost. His first lesson was strict precisely because it was elementary before telling taxpayers that something is a bargain. Know what they are buying. Ocasio-Cortez regrouped and reached for another credential she had used successfully for years, reminding the room that before Congress, she had worked as a waitress and bartender in the Bronx and knew what it felt like to check a bank balance before buying groceries. The point was obvious. She was positioning herself as someone who understood financial pressure from lived experience rather than from spreadsheets, and she used that experience to accuse Kennedy of reducing working-class needs to frightening numbers scribbled on a cheap notepad. It was a strong political instinct because personal biography can often shut down criticism by turning policy disagreement into a contest over authenticity. But Kennedy did not dispute that bartending was honest work, and he did not insult the people who do it. Instead, he moved the argument from whether Ocasio-Cortez had experienced financial pressure to whether that experience qualified anyone to manage trillions of dollars belonging to other people. Kennedy described his own background without trying to romanticize it, talking about people in Zachary who worked ordinary jobs, fixed their own vehicles, and understood what a tight month looked like. Then he drew the line. Ocasio-Cortez had invited him to draw. After bartending, she went to Congress and began voting on how public money would be spent after school. He went into Louisiana government and spent years managing public money directly. He emphasized the difference between talking about money and being responsible for the money itself, between delivering speeches about national priorities and tracking bonds, pensions, investments, accounts, and dollars that belong to working people. The contrast was not glamorous, which made it more damaging because spreadsheets, pension obligations, and account balances do not care about political branding. Once Ocasio-Cortez placed experience on the table as a qualification, Kennedy had every reason to place his experience beside hers and let the room compare the weight. She pushed back by arguing that managing Louisiana's finances was not the same as managing a federal budget and mocked the comparison as something like placing a lemonade stand beside a grocery chain. Kennedy did not reject the comparison. He picked it up and turned it around, remarking that Louisiana retirees might be interested to hear their pension funds described as a lemonade stand. Then he reminded the room that his work had involved recovering unclaimed property, returning money directly to citizens, pursuing major banks over deceptive practices, and dealing with accounts where somebody ultimately had to answer for where the money went. His point was not that Louisiana and the federal government were identical, because they obviously were not. His point was that money behaves according to the same unforgiving rule at every level of government. Once somebody else is spending it, the person who earned it deserves to know what happened after it left their hands. That was where the hearing began changing shape. Ocasio-Cortez had entered with a moral argument designed to force the committee to defend why it would resist spending. Kennedy had begun forcing her to defend why the spending itself deserved trust. Her biography, her grandmother's hardship, her critiques on Republican health care policy, and her warnings about working families all carried emotional and political force, but none answered the narrower question sitting beside Kennedy's water glass. The cheap notepad had become a symbol of the problem because every enormous claim eventually had to fit onto a small page as a number that either balanced or did not, and Kennedy was only beginning to count. Ocasio-Cortez shifted again because the personal experience argument had stopped carrying the weight she expected it to carry, and the next tactic available was data. She leaned forward with both hands on the table and began firing statistics in rapid succession, moving from inequality to climate damage to infrastructure investment, arguing that the top 1% controlled more wealth than the bottom half of the country combined, that climate disasters were costing taxpayers roughly $150 billion a year, that green infrastructure produced measurable returns, and that the national infrastructure gap itself ran into the trillions. The strategy was obvious: overwhelm the narrow question with a larger wall of numbers, make the scale of the problem feel so enormous that the scale of the proposed spending begins to look reasonable by comparison. Then she turned Kennedy's pocket notebook into the target, suggesting that while he was busy doing arithmetic, bridges were failing and communities were paying the price. It was the kind of line that works beautifully when nobody asks what sits underneath the statistics. Kennedy let her finish, left the pen resting on the notepad, and then returned to one specific claim she had made: the idea that every dollar invested could generate a much larger return. He did not challenge the slogan first. He challenged the routing. Where does the federal dollar actually go when it enters the machinery created by the bill? Who receives the first check? Which office touches it first? Which agency administers it? And how many layers exist between the taxpayer and the person supposedly benefiting from the program? Ocasio-Cortez opened her binder for the first time and began moving through prepared pages, naming the Department of Energy, Housing and Urban Development, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the broader administrative framework surrounding the proposal. Kennedy already knew the structure because he had read the bill: 14 agencies, 6 new interagency offices, hundreds of individual programs, and multiple levels of administrative review before the money reached an actual project. That was the point he had been moving toward from the beginning. The argument was no longer about whether climate resilience sounded desirable, because almost anything sounds desirable when described at the level of the brochure. The argument was about what happens to a dollar after Washington takes custody of it. Kennedy framed it the way someone with years of public finance experience would frame it, not as an inspirational promise, but as a chain of transactions in which every new office, consultant, compliance mechanism, and reporting requirement has a cost before the supposed beneficiary sees anything. Then came the number that changed the temperature of the hearing. Kennedy laid out the breakdown the script had been building toward: administrative expenses, salaries, offices, travel, consultants, compliance reporting, and layers of review steadily consuming the original dollar until only a fraction remained by the time it reached a working family. His figure was 19 cents. 19 cents out of a dollar, after the government had spent the rest operating the system designed to distribute it. That number landed harder than the trillions because people understand a dollar instinctively. They may not know what $4.7 trillion feels like, but they know exactly what it means to hand someone a dollar and get 19 cents back. Ocasio-Cortez objected that the breakdown was hypothetical and did not reflect the accountability mechanisms built into the proposal. Kennedy cut straight through the word because accountability is one of those Washington terms that can be printed on every cover page without proving that a program works. His response was not that oversight was unnecessary. It was that a promise of oversight does not change the plumbing. A complicated system remains complicated because somebody inserts the word accountability into the legislation. And if the path from taxpayer to beneficiary requires layers of agencies, consultants, compliance teams, administrative staff, and internal reports, then the burden of proving efficiency belongs to the people asking for trillions, not to the taxpayers asking what happened to the money. Kennedy then moved from the hypothetical to the concrete example contained in the original argument. He pointed to a 2021 federal green energy workforce grant of $240 million and asked how many permanent jobs it had produced. The answer in the script was 314, which translated to roughly $764,000 for every permanent job created. Suddenly, the discussion was not about an abstract return on investment or a model predicting future benefits. It was about a program with a cost, an outcome, and a division problem, so simple that anyone in the gallery could calculate the insult. Kennedy hammered the contrast by pointing out that in Louisiana, the same amount of money could buy a good house for far less than that per person, leaving enough money to make the original result look grotesquely inefficient. That was where the argument became risky for Ocasio-Cortez, because she had entered the hearing treating government spending as proof of commitment, while Kennedy was forcing the room to consider whether spending itself could become evidence of failure. A program can be compassionate in its stated purpose and still be wasteful in execution. It can be surrounded by noble language, urgent rhetoric, professionally designed reports, and the best intentions imaginable, while still consuming staggering amounts of public money for results that would be indefensible if presented on a household ledger. Kennedy's point was strictly uncomplicated. Government can take a dollar, grind it through a machine, return a dime-sized result, and then publish a report celebrating the process. Ocasio-Cortez tried to isolate the example, arguing that I'm so wine of Bill a kime, I'm so weth their wine of daughter Bo. I'm so wething one. I'm so weth or second edem that it was one program. Yes, it was one program. Her bill had 2 and 17. That response did not prove that every single program would perform identically, and Kennedy did not need it to. What it did was expose the scale of the risk if one badly designed program could consume hundreds of millions for a tiny permanent job count. Then a bill multiplying federal programs across agencies had to explain in detail why taxpayers should believe the same machinery would suddenly become disciplined simply because the number had become larger. The binder in front of Ocasio-Cortez was no longer helping because it was built to defend policy goals, not to answer the kind of plumbing questions Kennedy was asking. She had statistics about climate costs, infrastructure needs, inequality, and projected economic returns. But Kennedy kept dragging those claims down to the transaction level. Who gets the check? How much gets consumed before the project begins? What permanent result is produced? And what does each result actually cost? This was the gap between political advocacy and financial management that the hearing kept exposing. Advocacy measures ambition, management measures leakage. By this point, the room had changed. Democratic staffers were no longer visibly writing every line. Republican staffers had begun writing more aggressively, and the center of gravity had moved away from Ocasio-Cortez moral framing toward Kennedy's demand for receipts. She needed to change the battlefield before the arithmetic hardened into the only story anyone remembered. So she reached for the most reliable pivot in partisan politics. If your own numbers become uncomfortable, critique the other side's record. The next move would be to turn Kennedy from challenger into defendant by forcing him to answer for Republican spending, tax cuts, debt, and defense budgets. Kennedy had been waiting for that move because it was predictable, and predictable moves are easiest to counter. Ocasio-Cortez had already tried moral authority, biography, inequality, climate urgency, and projected returns each time. Kennedy had narrowed the question back to the same principle. What does it cost? Where does the dollar go? And what comes back after Washington finishes spending it? Now she was about to abandon the defense of her own plan long enough to put his party on trial, and Kennedy was ready to concede just enough to make the counterattack far more damaging. Ocasio-Cortez made the pivot exactly where Kennedy expected her to make it, shifting away from the bill in front of the committee and toward the Republican record on debt, taxes, and federal spending. She reminded the room that Republicans had presided over trillions of dollars in additional national debt, had supported tax cuts she argued disproportionately favored the wealthy, and had repeatedly approved enormous defense budgets while lecturing others about fiscal discipline. The purpose was not subtle if Kennedy could be forced to defend every dollar spent by his own party. Then the hearing could be transformed from an examination of her $4.7 trillion proposal into another familiar partisan fight, where both sides accuse the other of hypocrisy. Ocasio-Cortez sharpened the critique by portraying Kennedy's criticism as selective outrage, the kind of concern that suddenly becomes urgent only when the spending carries a progressive label. In another hearing against another senator, that might have worked, because hypocrisy is an easier argument to understand than administrative efficiency and a much easier argument to sell on television. Kennedy did something that disrupted the entire move before it could gather momentum. He conceded that Republicans had wasted money too. He said he had opposed spending from his own party when he believed it was excessive, and by refusing to pretend that every Republican bill had been fiscally responsible, he denied Ocasio-Cortez the defensive posture she was trying to force him into. That concession mattered because politicians often damage their own credibility by defending obvious failures simply because those failures belong to their side, and Kennedy refused to volunteer for that trap. If Republicans wasted money, he was willing to say so, but Republican waste did not make Democratic waste intelligent, efficient, or affordable. The hearing was not about proving that one party had never spent badly. It was about whether the proposal sitting in front of the committee could survive scrutiny on its own terms. Then Kennedy turned the historical argument back toward Ocasio-Cortez and began pulling receipts from her own political record. He raised the frequently asked questions document associated with the Green New Deal and pointed to the language about providing economic security for people unwilling to work, language her office had said came from an early draft released by mistake. The technical explanation did not erase the political damage because the phrase existed, circulated under the banner of the proposal, and became part of the public understanding of what her movement was asking the country to support. Kennedy's point was not simply that a staffer had made an error, it was that ambitious programs written at enormous scale often reveal their instincts in the details people later rush to call accidental. Ocasio-Cortez had come to the hearing demanding that others answer for the moral consequences of rejecting her spending, and Kennedy was now demanding that she answer for the words attached to her own agenda. He moved next to one of her most famous climate warnings, the statement that the world would end in 12 years if climate change was not addressed. Kennedy used the passage not to conduct a scientific debate, but to challenge the certainty with which Ocasio-Cortez often packaged political arguments, the habit of placing an expiration date on disaster and then treating anyone who questions the proposed remedy as unserious. His tone stayed dry as he pointed out that years had passed, the country was still here, Louisiana was still here, and the rhetorical deadline had not produced the kind of finality implied by the original language. The critique worked because it returned to the same problem Kennedy had been exposing throughout the hearing. Exaggeration becomes expensive when exaggeration is used to justify trillions in public spending. If a politician wants extraordinary financial authority, Kennedy's argument was that extraordinary claims deserve extraordinary discipline, not another round of applause. Then Kennedy moved from policy language to political imagery and invoked the Met Gala appearance where Ocasio-Cortez wore the now famous tax, the rich dress at an event associated with enormous wealth and exclusivity. He did not need to dwell on fashion, celebrity culture, or social media reaction, because the contradiction was strong enough on its own. Kennedy's line was that he did not attend $35,000 dinner parties and would not know what to wear, but that if he ever showed up to one dressed in a slogan demanding higher taxes on the wealthy, he would at least understand why working people might question the performance. That was not a technical budget argument, but it struck directly at the credibility Ocasio-Cortez had been claiming when she spoke about inequality, bartending, rent, groceries, and economic struggle. The deeper accusation was that symbolism had become a substitute for consistency, and Kennedy was using the image to show how easily political branding can drift away from the people it claims to represent. The room had already watched Kennedy convert trillion-dollar abstractions into household cost, program structures into administrative leakage, and personal biography into a comparison of professional experience. Now he returned to the Green New Deal itself and raised the enormous cost estimates that had circulated around the proposal, framing the figure as something approaching $93 trillion over the longer term. Whether discussed as a policy aspiration or a transformational economic program, the number was so large that Kennedy treated it as an invoice rather than an ideology. He emphasized the scale precisely because Ocasio-Cortez politics often relied on making the current system sound so morally unacceptable that any proposed replacement appeared reasonable by contrast. Kennedy's response was that a proposal does not become affordable because the problem is serious, and it does not become administratively sound because the rhetoric surrounding it is urgent. Then came the political fact Kennedy had been saving, because it challenged Ocasio-Cortez from a direction she could not dismiss as Republican resistance. When the Green New Deal was brought to the Senate floor, Democratic senators did not line up behind it with affirmative votes. They voted present. Kennedy leaned on that word because it exposed the gap between public enthusiasm for the slogan and private reluctance to attach a recorded yes vote to the legislative package. His argument was mercilessly simple. Politicians are often eager to stand beside a popular idea at a press conference, but a roll call vote forces them to put their names beside the invoice. If members of Ocasio-Cortez's own political coalition would not give the proposal an affirmative vote, Kennedy argued that the problem could not be dismissed as conservative hostility alone. Ocasio-Cortez answered that the vote had been a procedural maneuver designed by Republicans to place Democrats in a politically impossible position. Kennedy did not deny the maneuvering. He denied that procedure could erase the message contained in the outcome. His fourth lesson was that when your own side refuses to put its name on your proposal, the refusal functions like a performance review, whether the circumstances are politically convenient or not. The room had now heard Kennedy challenge the cost per household, the root of the money, the administrative structure, the efficiency of comparable programs, the historical rhetoric surrounding the Green New Deal, and the reluctance of Democrats to vote yes on it. Each move stripped another layer away from the moral shield Ocasio-Cortez had carried into the hearing. By then, the confrontation was no longer operating on the left versus right battlefield where Ocasio-Cortez was most comfortable. Kennedy had reduced it to the difference between spending money and managing it, between presenting a need and proving a mechanism, between demanding trust and earning it through numbers that could survive contact with a ledger. Ocasio-Cortez still had one line of critique left, and she reached for it by mocking Kennedy's style itself. The folksy delivery, the pocket notebook, the one-liners, the entire presentation she treated as too simple for the scale of the problems she wanted to solve. That criticism would give Kennedy exactly the opening he had been waiting for, because once she critiqued the notepad, instead of answering what was written inside it, the hearing had nowhere left to go except the final question, and Kennedy was about to close the notebook. Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward for the final time, but the posture no longer carried the same certainty it had at the beginning of the hearing. She critiqued Kennedy's presentation directly, dismissing the folksy delivery The cheap pocket notebook, the one-liners, and the idea that such simplicity could possibly qualify as serious governance in a discussion involving trillions of dollars and millions of lives. She argued that reducing human suffering to arithmetic on a $2 notepad revealed everything anyone needed to know about Kennedy's priorities. It was meant to diminish the method because she had not dismantled the substance to make the notebook look unserious because the questions written inside it had become impossible to escape. And in doing that, she finally gave Kennedy the opening he had been waiting for since the first question. Kennedy set the pen down, placed both hands on the desk, and answered with the kind of restraint that made the response more damaging than outrage would have been. He told her that she was right about one thing. This was not a comedy show. It was a budget hearing. And in a budget hearing, the essential question is not how passionately someone cares, but what the proposal costs and who ultimately pays for it. He did not accuse her of lacking compassion, because that would have allowed her to return immediately to the moral battlefield where she was strongest. Instead, he separated compassion from competence and concern from accounting. Everyone in the room could care deeply about struggling families, but caring did not make $4.7 trillion disappear, did not eliminate administrative waste, and did not answer the question of what taxpayers were purchasing. Then Kennedy began counting the failures of the previous hour. Ocasio-Cortez had not given him the household cost when he asked, had not clearly identified where the first federal dollar went inside the administrative structure, had not explained why the political coalition that praised her previous climate agenda refused to cast affirmative votes for it, and had not produced a simple answer to the routing question at the center of the hearing. Every time Kennedy had narrowed the discussion, Ocasio-Cortez had widened it again. She had answered questions about spending with stories about her grandmother, her bartending years, inequality, Republican spending, health care, climate disasters, and the failures of political opponents. Kennedy's accusation was overwhelming because it was not that she had said nothing, it was that she had said almost everything except what he had asked. He repeated the categories one after another, stripping them of their political power by placing them beside the unanswered question. There had been a morality lecture, an economics lecture, a history lecture, an experience lecture, and repeated critiques on the people asking for numbers. Each subject had value somewhere, but none functioned as a receipt for $4.7 trillion. Kennedy's point was that rhetoric can surround a budget, but cannot replace one, just as a story can explain why action matters without proving that a particular spending mechanism works. By the time he reached the end of the list, the hearing had become a demonstration of how easily political confidence collapses when every escape route leads back to arithmetic. Kennedy looked down at the little notebook Ocasio-Cortez had mocked and closed it. The spiral binding made the smallest sound in the room, but by then the notebook had become more than stationary because it represented everything the polished binder had failed to do. It contained numbers small enough to understand, questions narrow enough to answer, and the kind of accounting discipline that enormous federal programs often try to bury beneath scale. Kennedy reminded the people watching that the lesson was not free because taxpayers themselves had paid for the hearing, the institutions, the salaries, and ultimately the programs being debated. Those taxpayers deserve something more useful than conviction. They deserve to know what happened to their money. Then he asked the question one final time, where does the money go? Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth, moved toward the microphone, glanced toward the binder, and stopped. The prepared material that had supported every previous answer suddenly offered no protection because Kennedy's question did not ask whether climate change mattered, whether inequality existed, whether Puerto Rico had suffered, or whether Republicans had wasted money. It asked what happened to $1 after Washington took it from the person who earned it. According to the script, No answer came. The silence became the conclusion because Kennedy did not try to rescue it with another joke or another punchline. He simply waited while the room absorbed the fact that the witness who had arrived determined to teach the committee moral obligations could not supply the simple financial explanation the committee had demanded. The cameras remained fixed, the staffers behind Ocasio-Cortez stopped moving, and the binder stayed closed. The moment worked precisely because nothing dramatic had to be added to it. After an hour of argument, the absence of an answer carried more weight than another 10 minutes of speaking could have carried. What followed exposed the larger weakness Kennedy had been critiquing from the beginning. Ocasio-Cortez is powerful in environments where political passion itself carries value, where a crowd can reward certainty immediately, and where a sharp line can become the conclusion before anyone has time to examine the numbers underneath it. A Senate budget hearing works differently because the applause does not close the ledger. The committee can admire a goal and still demand a mechanism, accept that a problem is serious and still reject an inefficient solution, understand suffering and still ask who gets the check. That difference between emotional persuasion and fiscal explanation was the distance Kennedy forced Ocasio-Cortez to cross, and the script's entire confrontation is built around her failure to cross it. Kennedy's advantage was not that he cared more, spoke louder, or possessed some magical argument unavailable to anyone else. His advantage was that he kept returning to the same basic financial disciplines: know the cost, know the root, know the administrative loss, know the result, and know whether the people asking for money can explain those things without changing the subject. Ocasio-Cortez had attempted to use her working-class biography as evidence of fiscal authority. But Kennedy forced a distinction between understanding what it feels like to lack money and understanding how to manage billions of dollars belonging to other people. There is no insult in recognizing that those are different skills. The insult would be pretending they are the same simply because the political story sounds better that way. That is the deeper indictment contained in the hearing. A politician can be sincere about a problem, intelligent about its causes, charismatic in explaining its human cost, and still be riskily careless about the financial mechanism offered as the cure. Moral certainty does not create fiscal literacy, and compassion does not automatically produce administrative competence. If a government program takes $1 from a worker, consumes most of it inside its own machinery, and sends a fraction back while declaring victory, the noble language printed on the legislation does not repair the loss. The people funding the system have every right to ask the same crude, unsophisticated, supposedly reductive question Kennedy kept asking. That is why the $2 notebook ultimately mattered more than the binder. The binder represented preparation for the argument Ocasio-Cortez expected to have, while the notebook represented the accounting she could not avoid once Kennedy refused to play by the rules of a political rally. She could return to the House, continue advocating, continue telling the stories that helped build her political career, and continue proposing large federal programs in the name of transformation. But every future proposal carries the same unresolved burden once someone strips away the slogans and asks taxpayers to imagine the money leaving their own bank account. Where does the money go?